Welcome to ExplainerCast, episode 22, where we have some explaining to do. I am your host, Dave Smith.
And this is Shane Swenson.
And today we're going to be talking about an interesting internet phenomenon that involved some cybersecurity, some caching, and some content distribution.
That's right. So we've got a lot of explaining to do on this one, Dave.
Yes. Where do we start?
Yeah, so I think where I would like to start is I read recently about a geolocation attack against what's supposed to be a secure, potentially anonymous messaging system. A system that is actually pretty highly respected in the security community called Signal. And wondering, Dave, if you had heard about this as well, or if this one just came across my radar only.
It just hit my radar because you shared it with me, and I think this is like very recent, like in the last week, right?
Yeah, I just saw it last week. I forget when it was disclosed. I think it was disclosed a little while ago, so that the providers had a chance to try and address it. But yeah, it just hit the news recently. So maybe we should start by just talking about, I guess, why is this even interesting? So first of all, like, give me your perspective, Dave. How secure do you picture like person-to-person messaging in the first place? Do you picture it as sort of wide open? You're sending postcards through the office mail, or do you picture something a little more secure than that?
Well, this really, in my mind, varies a lot depending on the medium you choose to communicate with. Like, in the early days of the internet, or at least my early days on the internet, email was like the postcard in the mail, meaning anyone can read this thing as it transits the internet on the way to its destination inbox.
Right.
And things evolved to provide more levels of security. And, kind of settling in on the modern day, some of these applications are intended to be what they call end-to-end encrypted.
Yep.
Meaning that I type a message on my phone, it's encrypted with a key that only my phone knows. It transits the internet in an encrypted form where, even though it might pass through the hands of servers that could see the content of the encrypted message, they could never hope to decrypt it.
Right.
And then once it arrives at the final destination, it can be decrypted only by the person that was intended to receive it.
Yep.
And so, I consider this to be pretty good. Like probably the best we could hope for in a world where the internet is so open and packets of data flow like they do.
Right.
And that's what Signal is built to be, Signal, the messaging app.
Yeah, and maybe we'll talk another time about the actual encryption side of it. But you're absolutely right. It's possible mathematically and computationally to make something that I encrypt and it can only be read by you, and you can confirm that it could only have been encrypted by me. So I use a secret that only I know to encrypt it, and I use information related to a secret that only you know that you will then use to decrypt it. So you can check both authenticity and integrity. And one of the challenges with these apps, and actually if we were to talk about the history, as you said, with email, it was totally unencrypted. And even like text messages from phone to phone by default were also unencrypted in the early days. And so those also were visible, at least to the phone company, the telecommunications providers in the middle. And so this idea of end-to-end encryption, where it's encrypted on my device, decrypted on yours, is really a major step forward for privacy.
Yeah.
There are a couple of remaining challenges in securing end-to-end communication, though, and they tend to relate to how we connect to each other.
Like that initial connection, you mean?
Or like how we sort of become friends, if you will, on the app. Or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Am I even allowed to send a message to you? And how does the message get from me to you? Have you thought about the path that the message takes from, say, my phone to yours when we're chatting back and forth?
You mean like the data infrastructure, like the networking infrastructure that it follows to get there?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And so that's like, there's a ton of hops involved there. And we've talked about this in some of our telecommunications series, which you can go back and reference. But, from my phone, it's going to put together a packet and send it over the network. It's going to go through a device on my home network, some router.
Yep.
And then that router has to send it somewhere. And where it's going to go is my internet service provider, their first router, the one that's closest to me, or whatever has a direct connection to me. And then it'll probably pass through anywhere between, 4 to 15 other routers that are operated by companies who I probably haven't even heard of before it arrives at your cell phone.
Yeah, and certainly that you have no relationship to. Like, they're just the providers that... Actually, it turns out there is one other party in this that you didn't mention in that. There really are three sort of known parties in this communication. If I'm communicating with you, there's you and me, but there's also the service provider that's providing the communication service itself. So if we're using Signal, we're also using Signal's servers as an intermediary to pass the messages between us.
Yeah, which might be a surprise to some people to think like, no, this isn't just me to Shane.
Right.
It's me to Signal and from Signal to Shane.
Exactly.
And that's done because there's a lot of technical reasons that makes the communication a lot easier. In fact, I think we did a whole episode on NAT.
Yep.
And that's one reason that it works this way. It's not the only reason.
Yeah. And the other big reason is if I send a message and your device isn't online to receive it right now, it needs to go somewhere and wait. And these intermediate points do that. And again, going back to text messaging, that happens in texts as well. Like I can send a text and the recipient's not available right now. And again, the telecommunications infrastructure holds on to that text message using a technique called store and forward, and then delivers it to you when it can. So that intermediate server, there's two kinds of intermediate servers then. There are those pass-through entities like routers and maybe your firewall or your NAT. And then there's this more persistent application server provided by the communications organization, or like Signal, or maybe your mobile phone provider for texts, that's actually holding on to the message and then delivering it when it can. And so it used to be that there was no encryption. Then the next level was, well, let's put at least encryption from me to that forwarding server, like say Signal server. I don't think they ever built this style, but some of the other P2P, person-to-person messaging apps did, where they said, we'll encrypt the traffic from the device to the server through all those intermediate routers, and then we'll encrypt the traffic from the server to the recipient, but it was actually unencrypted at the server itself. So they could see the to, the from, and the content. And as a result, sometimes governments ask them to hand over that content in a warrant or ask them to maybe filter or police that content. And so this is part of where the push for end-to-end encryption came from, which was essentially to hide the content of the message from that intermediate server.
Yep, and anybody else.
But there is still something observable to that intermediate server in an encrypted message transaction from me to you, Dave. Do you know what that would be?
Well, at the very least, the fact that you sent a message to me.
Exactly. Yeah. So if the intermediate server is routing messages from me to you, it does know that. It knows I sent you a message at a certain time, maybe had a certain size. And there's value in that because it helps to filter so that I only receive messages from people I know. But in some cases, even that level of observability is too much. Like if I'm trying to communicate with somebody and I really don't want, again, say a government to know that I'm communicating with, maybe a member of a dissident organization or a member of the foreign press or something like that.
Yeah, I was thinking like whistleblowers,
right,
or people who have ethically good reasons to do that. Maybe you want to communicate with a journalist, something like that. You just don't want anyone to know you're doing that,
right?
Especially not your employer.
Yeah. And so Signal actually did implement a mechanism for that where you can anonymously send messages to somebody. And essentially, if you're going to accept anonymous messages, you take away Signal's ability to adjudicate if you ought to receive a message from that person or not. And they essentially can package the message so that it anonymizes who it's from. It still has to indicate who it's going to. And so it's still going to be the recipient is still going to show they received a message from somewhere, but even the Signal platform wouldn't be able to confirm who or where that message came from. So the reason I bring things like that up is it's not probably commonplace to think about this level of privacy and security, but there are people in the world for whom this could literally mean life and death. And so some of these apps do try to be extremely security conscious, extremely privacy conscious. And so that's kind of the context that makes this attack, this geolocation attack that I want to talk to you about, more interesting.
Yes.
And so I guess to get into that, we have to talk about one other part of that server infrastructure, and that is what's even out there that might give an indication of where I'm located in the world. And again, there's a technology, we hinted at it in one of our previous episodes, but we'll talk about it a bit more. This comes back to the way that the internet has evolved from really a bunch of computers in specific corporate offices to a distributed network of servers around the world. So Dave, I wonder if you want to talk about what a CDN or a content delivery network is and does.
For sure. And to tee this up, I think it's interesting that any messaging app like Signal, of course, its core function is to deliver messages. But like Shane, like you mentioned, it also has to do a bunch of other things around the periphery of delivering a message.
Yeah.
Like Shane, you mentioned keeping track of friends, like who's authorized to message me, who's on my contact list. I want to see a profile picture of that person. Let's see, what else? I want to put my like status to whether I'm active or idle. All of these things that are not directly sending a message, but make the overall messaging experience useful.
Right.
And so in the case of Signal, everyone on Signal has a profile picture that you can upload.
Yep.
And I mean, I guess you're uploading these things directly to Signal's servers. And it's not like, I mean, I don't know about this for sure, but I don't know, Shane, do you know, are these like stored in some magic encrypted format on your phone, or are they just like a standard web application where you've got some data store with all these pictures in it?
Based on the way this works, I suspect it's the latter. It's call it that standard web application where your profile is basically in a database in their servers, and the associated assets like your profile picture would be stored in some storage that they control that's connected to that database.
Exactly. And so given that that's the case, Signal built this very interesting system where I can put my profile picture on their web application, and then other people can look me up and they can see my profile picture. And it's like part of the way, it's like, I guess it's one of the ways you verify that you're messaging the person that you thought you were messaging. And when your name is Dave Smith, this is actually a very important feature.
Yeah.
Because there are many of us.
Yeah, I should know if I ever, whenever I try to connect with you, I have to sort through a long list of Dave Smiths to find the right one.
Yes. I am hard to find, hiding in plain sight. I'm like in a needle of a Dave Smith haystack.
That's right.
Anyway, so CDN. CDN stands for Content Distribution Network. And this is a technology that was developed, I don't know, probably the first ones started appearing like 20 years ago or so.
Yeah, I'd say 25, like very late 90s, early 2000.
Yeah, kind of when the internet was starting to really grow.
Yep.
And what happened was, if you imagine what it's like to be an end user on let's say you're sitting on a computer in your home, and you're visiting some website, and that website's got a bunch of images on it and other files that the page needs to download, like CSS files and JavaScript files that every web page needs to download. But let's just say, like, I'm sitting in my home, like right now in Utah, but the web server is actually located in Virginia, which is across the country from me.
Yep.
And, it's a solid 70 milliseconds plus of round trip time for every packet to get there and back to me. And so a lot of web companies decided, we would like that to be a faster experience. We don't want people who are far away from our servers to have a slow experience waiting for our pages to load.
Yep.
So they built this idea of buying servers and installing them in all the major cities around the world, really. I mean, initially I'm sure it was more of a, like not all around the world, but nowadays there are content distribution network servers in every major city on earth.
Yeah.
Like, to give you a reference, like Amazon operates a big CDN called CloudFront. There are hundreds of what they call POPs, or points of presence.
Right.
CloudFlare, which is the one we're going to talk about in the Signal exploit, also a huge CDN, also hundreds of edge servers, points of presence all around the world.
Yep.
So anyway, the idea here is, all right, let's say Dave is going to my website. I've got a big hero image right on the front of my website. It's a big file. I want to serve that image to Dave from a server that is actually close to Dave.
Yeah.
And so the CDN's job is to do a combination of DNS magic and other things so that when I look up the IP address for a hostname that hosts that image, I get an IP address of a server that's close to me.
Right.
And it's the CDN's job to make sure that the servers that I resolve are the closest ones.
Yep.
And so now, instead of waiting 60, 70 milliseconds to get from Utah to Virginia, I might be waiting just 20 milliseconds. And you might think, well, that's not a huge improvement. Who can sell 40 milliseconds? Well, this has a multiplicative effect, because most web pages nowadays have dozens and dozens of image and other static content requests that they make.
Yep.
And carving 40 milliseconds off across, say, 20 or 30 requests, that can make a really big difference in the perceived page load time. And of course, there's an economic incentive to do this for most consumer-facing applications, which is that tons and tons of companies have done studies to show that when pages load fast, people buy more.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's where we are.
Yeah.
That's where we are. And so Signal did exactly what I would do if I were building this web application to host profile pictures, which is they employed a CDN, and the CDN they chose was Cloudflare.
Right.
So when you open up your phone and you open the Signal app, and it loads up a list of your contacts, each of those little circular profile pictures is downloading not directly from Signal servers, but from Cloudflare servers.
Right.
And I just want to say, I'll just say one more thing about how that works, which is that when I make a request to a Cloudflare server for an image, Cloudflare will actually go and get the image from the source server, which in this case is going to be some Signal web server,
Right.
located who knows where.
Yep.
And it will download a copy of that image to its own server and then store it for the next time. And then again, and then send the copy to me.
Right.
And then the next time my phone wakes up and tries to ask for that same image, now it's got it there. And anyone else in my area who requests that same image from that Cloudflare server will get the cached version of that file rather than having to go all the way back to wherever the source or what they call the origin server is located.
Yeah. And that idea of caching is so important to just the efficiency of especially the internet applications, but really many applications take advantage of caching, which just means save a copy for later and then reuse that so that you can dramatically cut down on duplicate work. And it makes sense, especially for frequently accessed content that doesn't change very often, which, maybe a popular profile picture, totally fits that model. And so I agree with you. It's a totally natural choice that Signal made. And in your example, Dave, where we're in Utah, we actually have decent access across the continental United States. But if you look at global internet traffic and you think about the value of caching something on the other side of an ocean for terrestrial local access, that value increases dramatically in that caching.
Oh, yeah.
So, and then honestly, companies like Cloudflare have done a good job of making it really easy to use their services. They essentially provide that CDN and caching service as part of their web hosting infrastructure. So it's not a very technically complex task to set it up compared to what it was when people initially built these out. So it's kind of the easy button, natural thing to do. So where does this get us into trouble then? What's the problem?
Well, the problem is that, and I don't know if this is exactly where you're going, but I'll just say what I think it is, which is that every time someone requests a file or a URL from one of these CDNs, there's actually a side effect of that request.
Yeah.
Which is that there is a cached copy that is made. And this may be surprising. I don't actually personally know why they do this, but every CDN I've worked with has an indicator in the HTTP response that says whether the download was from a cache hit or a cache miss. And this is caching terminology. Hit means that I am giving you a copy of this file that I had locally stored and I did not have to go back to the origin to get it.
Right.
A cache miss means I am giving you a copy of this file, but I did have to go back to the origin server to get it.
Yep.
And what that means is that if you're the first person to request a file from a CDN edge server, it will tell you that it was a cache miss.
Yep.
If you're the second or subsequent person, it will tell you it was a cache hit.
Exactly. Yep. And so that ended up being the key to this exploit. And actually, the profile picture thing, we'll talk about why that's special. But the initial version of this exploit that the author of the exploit disclosed was that if they sent a message to somebody and they included an attachment, and they discovered that if they included an image, that the recipient's device, when they opened the message, it would auto-download the image. And so they'd attach an image to a message, send a message. Once they got a read receipt that came back and said you'd read the message, then they could go and try to tell essentially which of the CDN nodes, which of those locations across the globe now had a cached copy of that image. And that essentially told them that's probably the metro area or the CDN node that you are closest to.
So interesting. I'm actually surprised to hear that image attachments fell into this category, that wasn't considered secure enough to put into the encrypted message.
So let me think about that for a second.
I'm not questioning it. I just think it's a weird choice.
No, you're right. That is a bit of a weird choice. I didn't think about that when I read it. But yeah, what if I sent you a screenshot of something very sensitive?
Yeah.
It sort of makes no sense.
Is that what happened here? Or was it, I know it happened with profile pictures, but did it happen with image attachments too?
As I recall, they talked about the first thing that they got this working with was attached images.
Interesting. I guess you could just send a link directly to a CDN and, then it's completely outside of the Signal ecosystem.
Right. And it's also possible that the image itself was still encrypted. So you download this encrypted bundle. Now, it kind of calls into question, like maybe it was just lazy application development, because like why would you cache, an encrypted thing that's destined for one party? So I think you and I both made the assumption like, oh, you would only enable caching of assets that are broadly distributable.
Right. Or at least more than one person accessing it.
But if they just put it in a static asset bucket and had a standard infrastructure configuration that said all my static assets in this bucket should have caching enabled, they may just not have optimized for that case. So very good question.
Yeah, interesting. But I mean, either way, whether Signal encrypts attachments or not, I could send you a link to click on.
Sure.
And if you clicked, of course, if I can get you to click a link, I can figure out everything I need to know about
there's a lot going on at that point.
Yeah. So the attachment thing was a particularly effective attack because Signal would download the attachment without the user's consent.
Yeah, there's one click. You clicked into the message, but then by default, Signal auto-downloads attachments. And I haven't looked at my settings to see if you can disable that. Wouldn't surprise me if you could, but most people use the default settings, whatever they may be, in an app like that. So 2 things remain. One of them is talking about how the author of this exploit actually figured out which CDN node had a cached copy. And then the other is how they then turned it into a 0-click attack using profile pictures. Which way do you want to go first?
Well, actually, I want to say something even weird before that, if that's okay. Did you read about who reported this exploit?
No.
Okay, I read that it is a person whose name is Daniel. That's all they disclosed. And 15 years old.
Oh, I did see that. Yes.
Does that make you wonder what we've been doing with our lives?
Seriously, what was I doing?
By age 15?
Yeah.
I'm just so impressed with this kid.
Yeah.
15 years old and figuring out exploits in one of the world's most popular CDNs and most popular end-to-end encrypted messaging systems. Just amazing.
And then had the moral scruples to disclose it in a responsible way.
That might be the greatest part of all.
Yeah, the kids are all right, huh?
The most unlikely.
Yeah.
I, for one, welcome our new overlords.
Seriously. Welcome, Daniel. Yeah, that's awesome.
Anyway, so yes, back to your question.
Yeah. So 2 parts. Yeah. So maybe we'll talk about how he figured out the CDN side, and then we'll go to the 0-click side. And again, he disclosed sort of one way that he did this, but I think the reality is, as you said, and this is kind of an engineering concept, anything that has a side effect, meaning it changes the state or configuration of the system, tends to have ways to then observe that side effect. And so it's a bit of a risk when you're building a secure system to allow side effects, because if you can make the system always identical to how it was before something happened, it's a lot harder to then ask it what happened later. But in this case, the side effect is that these CDN nodes cache the data that passes through them, and specifically, they only cache the data that they are asked for. So if every node in the CDN cached that content, this would have been harder to exploit. And if no nodes in the CDN cache the content, be harder to exploit. But in this case, the exact nodes that were asked for the data are the ones that will cache it. So that's the side effect.
Yes.
And then in this particular case, there was, I'll call it a weakness in the way that CloudFlare was operating their CDN, which was that, and I didn't look at the exact detail of this, but I think I got the gist. If you were running code sort of inside the CloudFlare ecosystem, and they provide a way to do this, that code could query CDNs sort of by name. Like you could say either by IP address or a specific host name, go to this specific CDN. So you could actually steer your requests.
And it probably had like the name of the city and the host name or something.
Yeah, or they might have had IP ranges. I forget what they used. But as opposed to like us on the outside, where we might just get directed to whichever one's closest, and we may not have a good way of influencing that. But anyway, on the inside, they could sort of reliably ask each CDN in kind, do you have this piece of data? And basically get back, I don't remember if it was a yes, no, or if they would get back and look at that cache hit or miss header, and thus assess, okay, I swept through everything in the CDN across all the nodes, and I can see I got cache hits in these 2 locations, misses everywhere else. So you're somewhere in those 2 locations are adjacent, major metropolitan areas. Okay, you're in that region. It's pretty clear. Or at least your network presence is in that region, maybe using a VPN or something like that.
So that was the exploit, is you could send a harmless message to someone and then figure out what city they're in.
Yeah. Yeah.
A seemingly harmless message.
Yep, exactly. And Cloudflare did address this particular pathway of querying all the CDN nodes for a cache hit or a cache miss. But the problem is that because this is a side effect, that the caches are only updated on nodes that receive requests, there's sort of always going to be other observables unless you intentionally make the thing behave poorly. And I'll tell you what I mean by that.
Yes.
The next way, let's say, so I think Cloudflare closed that. And if I'm remembering right, the paper may have even mentioned that they did this next technique, which is, what if I just get access to a bunch of cheap rental servers in data centers all around the world, and I issue a query from each of them using the standard web address for that asset. I'll get steered to the closest CDN node to that server in that data center.
In other words, the CDN will work as intended.
As intended. And I just ask the question essentially from a lot of different points on the planet, and I see which answers come back as cache hit, and they actually give you the airport code of the CDN, or the nearest airport to the CDN when they reply. So they tell you, yes, I got a hit, and I'm near Washington Dulles. Great.
Oh my gosh. But did they close that?
I don't know that they closed that one. So
oh my gosh,
you can just scan.
I don't know if it's just me, but I've always wondered why these CDNs give so much information about the edge server that served the request.
Yeah, and why they give it out publicly. Like I've wondered this too. Like part of it goes back to that ethos of the internet, and we talked about how it started in the 60s and 70s as ARPANET, where it was just, hey, can we make computers communicate efficiently, sort of, with each other? And it was a free for all.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
You're always in debug mode, basically. So you want to see everything that's happening.
Yeah.
And we're still kind of in debug mode.
We're actually all amazed this is actually working at all. So
yeah.
let's turn on all the debug stuff.
Yeah. So Dave, how come in 2025 the internet is still in debug mode? Like,
I don't know.
It's still in beta.
I don't know. But I'll tell you, as an honest internet user who develops applications, I really appreciate it because I can tell if my CDN caching strategy is working or not.
Exactly. Yeah, but when you're trying to secure public figures, it's a different problem.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
So yeah, they do still, I think, disclose this. I could check right now, but I'll just assume. But let's say they didn't. Let's say they shut it. Let's say they say, okay, I'm no longer going to tell you if you got a cache hit or not. I'm no longer going to give you an airport code in the headers of the reply. I claim you can still exploit this because you could do a timing measurement. You make a request.
Yes.
And if it comes back in, 50 milliseconds or less, you got a cache hit. If it takes more than 100 milliseconds because it had to reach back to the origin server, just like measuring the speed of light over distance, you can actually tell if it was sort of satisfiable or not. But I would guess the delta between cache hit and cache miss and timing is huge. And this is why I said you'd have to make the CDN stop working well if you want to hide that observable. And really secure systems will actually do this. They'll say, based on the state of my system and the side effects that have taken place, if I can give you fast or slow service or good or bad service, somebody can then use that to measure something they're not supposed to measure about my secure system. And so you have to make everything terrible, equally bad.
Yes, which kind of defeats the purpose of the CDN in the first place.
Yeah, and it actually defeats, I think, human nature's willingness to pay for privacy. Most human beings will pay for privacy if it costs them nothing.
Yeah, they'll pay for it if it costs them
it's
nothing.
Free.
That's exactly what I was thinking. They're willing to pay one price, zero.
And it goes further. If there's no visible degradation of service, so it costs them no time. And if it takes no effort to configure, if it's on by default, so it takes them no effort. So yeah, no money, no time, no effort, then we're good with security and privacy.
Free, fast, and secure. Pick 3. That's like the consumer mode on privacy.
It's like a new unsatisfiable iron triangle problem. It's the CAP theorem of privacy.
Yes, it's actually not possible.
So yeah, it turns out that's a really hard problem.
Maybe that's why the CDNs decided to leave all the cache hit and miss metrics, because they're like, look, you're going to be able to tell anyway.
Right.
We may as well make it easier for you.
Yeah, at least we can deliver that free service efficiently. Like, if we're going to not be secure, let's just buy into it.
Right.
So yeah, I think that problem won't go away.
Yep.
Now let's talk about the last bit of it. So in the example we gave, and we hinted at the other one, but the example we gave with I send you a message, you actually had to open the message before the app would auto-download the attachment, which then would populate the CDN with the cache. So then this next step, that went to a zero-click attack relied on a feature of Signal where you could send someone a friend request, and when you receive a friend request, Signal auto downloads the avatar of that friend so it can show it to you in the notification associated with the friend request. And that's what makes it zero click.
And so you're saying the notification, meaning it could just pop up on my phone.
Yeah. So it just pops up on your phone and says, I don't know if you get this. I get like spam texts these days. A message comes in, says, hey, how are you? It's from a number I don't recognize. I delete it. But in the case of Signal, it's basically the same thing. It's a random friend request shows up on your phone. Hey, random name wants to connect with you. It's got some weird little avatar, a little cartoon or something. And what would you do? You would just ignore it most of the time, I would assume, especially if you're like a public figure who probably gets lots of inbound junk that you don't pay attention to.
Yeah, for sure.
But your phone actually did go and download that avatar in order to show you that notification.
Yes.
And that means that your phone went to the CDN. It pulled the avatar through the the closest CDN node. That CDN node cached it. And now the attacker can go use whichever cache scanning mechanism they want to use, the original one we talked about or the distributed query one. And they can tell which CDN you're closest to or that your network closest to right now.
Wow. You could literally be sleeping. Your phone is on your nightstand and boom, someone can figure out what city you're in.
Yeah, exactly.
And I guess this has been fixed, and we'll have to talk about the fix later, but I could have done this I could have mapped out the entire world. I'm assuming if I had some way to enumerate Signal users, I could figure out all the users and all the locations.
Yeah, you send a friend request. You send a unique friend request. So the other thing you do is you rev the avatar every time you do this.
You got to change your own profile picture every time.
Yeah. But okay.
It's a little bit slow.
Sure, you could generate those with just a little pattern generator or something, a little geometric thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that'll create a unique asset in the database in the bucket of avatars. And then, you just kick out friend requests one by one as you do this. Scan the CDN at your leisure for all of these assets, and you start mapping a population.
This is like Find My Friends for
Stalk My Friends.
City level for everyone. Yeah, for everyone you know.
Yeah.
And they don't even have to opt in. See, it's actually great privacy. Like they don't even have to allow you. You just just find out where you are.
That's the zero click side of it. It's just it's just there.
The zero effort, zero cost.
Yeah. So if you're the kind of person that needs to hide your geographic location, and again, there's other things like turns out the operators of telecom infrastructure and organizations that have infiltrated the operators of telecom infrastructure or have warrant access to them can tell what cell towers you're connecting to.
Yeah. If you need to hide your location, probably don't use a cell phone or the internet or computers or anything.
Yeah. It's sort of hard to be a 21st century human being and not do those things, though. So that's a bit of a conundrum.
Yes, it is indeed.
So something that actually would help mitigate this would be ubiquitous use of a VPN. So again, I don't know that I want to give advice to people who, if you're in the category of people who this matters for, you probably want to figure this out for yourself or talk to people you trust. But one idea that comes to mind is if all of your Signal traffic or any app traffic really is also routed through a VPN you trust, then someone who tries to run this geolocation attack is going to see that the CDN node closest to the VPN server that your traffic is coming out into the internet on is actually going to be the one that shows up. So you pick your locale and have a VPN node that puts your point of presence there. That's what people are going to observe. And so
it puts your point of presence somewhere you'll never be.
Yes. Yeah.
Because that's what your location is going to be reported to Daniel.
Exactly.
Our good friend Daniel knows where you are.
Yep.
Did Signal or Cloudflare do anything? You mentioned that Cloudflare closed an exploit that allowed attackers to get access to internal IP address lists or host names or something.
Yeah.
They closed that.
Yep.
Did Signal do anything?
I don't think so. I think at least in that report, Daniel said that they essentially pointed the finger at the CDN, or they pointed the finger at their users, and they said, "Oh, it's our users' job to implement network protection." So probably what they really mean by that is you should use a VPN if you care, but it did feel like a little bit of a cop-out answer.
Yeah, that's surprising coming from them.
Yeah, again, I had sort of had higher hopes than that as far as them as an organization. And then on the Cloudflare side, they did acknowledge that the particular enumeration exploit that allowed sort of this internal query of all the CDN nodes, that was a problem. And I think they paid a very small bug bounty for that, and they closed that. They'd actually received, I think, a report about that a year earlier, but it didn't look important to them until it was coupled to this more targeted exploit.
The avatar, was it the avatar step that got them to take interest?
The signal thing in general. So someone previously had just said, "Hey, I can scan your CDN nodes," and they were probably like, "Okay, so what?" And so here saying I can use that capability to geolocate people, however I do it.
I know, and it is very impressive actually that someone thought to do that, because when you explained it to me, I'm like, oh yeah, that would work.
Right.
But if you had asked me, use a CDN to figure out where people are located. Actually, even that question, I would have been like, oh, yeah, I guess I probably could
Once
do that.
Once you think about it.
But it never would have occurred to me. Yeah, it never would have occurred to me
to
try it in the first place.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it was the same to me. As soon as I read it, it was sort of like facepalm obvious. Like, oh, of course.
Yes.
Of course.
Yes.
But yet.
Like all the great exploits are, right? It's like everyone facepalms.
Yeah, totally. It's finding them.
But only one kid named Daniel has actually thought about it.
Exactly.
I mean, presumably, and I don't know Daniel. I wish I did. I'd love to just give him a high five for the ingenuity. But presumably, Daniel heard about the exploit of potentially using a CDN node to determine someone's location, and then later was like, oh, I'll bet you they do a CDN lookup for signal avatars, and then figured that out. Probably used Charles proxy or something to figure that out.
Yeah, he used a proxy. Yeah, so he could pop open the SSL and see what was going on inside the encrypted channel to the server. But yeah, I think it's one of those, as a security researcher, and it's same, as engineers, when you're trying to debug a system, the number of possible things that could go wrong is tremendous. And so you're looking around for which ones actually are happening. And that's where I think when you see, oh, wait a minute, they're actually caching this thing, that's when the light bulb goes off. Yeah. It goes on.
Yeah. The alarm goes off, the light bulb goes on.
That's right.
All right. Well, did we explain everything we came to explain?
I think so. Yeah, this was fun.
All right. That was a great one, Shane. I'm really glad you put that on my radar. I love these kinds of, I would call this like a distributed system exploit, where you have multiple components interacting in ways no one anticipated.
Exactly.
To get information no one thought was available.
Yeah. Distributed systems and complex systems.
Yes.
Definitely surprise you.
I love it. Very good. Well, we had some explaining to do. We did some explaining.
Yeah.
Thank you, Shane. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Good to talk to you again, Dave.